We have brought together three terrific speakers to help us unpack what this all means. We have Julia Attwood, who is the research director at Sightline Climate. She's dialing in from London. Hello, Julia. We have Heather Reams, who is the president of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, or CRES, which is a Washington, D.C. nonprofit that has close ties with Republican lawmakers. And we have J.C. Sandberg, who's the chief policy officer of the American Clean Power Association. American Clean Power is the largest clean energy trade group representing over 800 companies. And thank you all for being with us. And for all of you on the line, we have opportunities for you to participate. You can put questions in the Q&A. We already have 40 people on the line, and I know we have more that we're expecting. Julia, I'm going to let you start it off because you bring kind of a global perspective. Sitting in London, and Sightline does research on the state of the climate investment landscape. How do you look at the big, beautiful bill in terms of its macro impact? And what's your high level take on where we landed after all of the back and forth between the the House version and the Senate version and the ultimate bill that was enacted just a few weeks ago? Is it positive, negative, neutral? Love your take. And then, if you want to dive a little deeper into how Sightline sees the tech landscape from here, feel free to do so.
Absolutely. Well, there certainly was a lot of back and forth, and we spent a lot of time tracking that, as well as all of the tariff battles that were also going on and also have a pretty large effect. I would say that this bill is definitely negative, but it wasn't as bad as we were expecting it to be. So there was a lot of debate about whether Congress would take a scalpel or a sledgehammer to the IRA, and I think we ended up with it being more than a scalpel, but less than a bulldozer. So it obviously has a lot of implications for wind and solar, which were kind of singled out for special treatment, seeing their tax credits winding down much earlier. But there were also pretty sharp endings of subsidies for electric vehicles, for home energy efficiency, and for SAF. I'm going to be a little controversial and say that I actually think it's neutral for things like geothermal and nuclear. They've really been talked about as the bright spot, but I think it's a case of putting your money where your mouth is. We would need to see a lot more movement from the LPO on trying to fund some of these early projects in order for me to say, yeah, it's definitely positive for that. I think the really clear positives are carbon capture and also biofuels. So because a land use consideration was actually removed from some of those credits, it ends up being pretty good for biofuels. So obviously there was a lot in here. The one thing that really stuck out to me as being positive was around tax credit transferability and direct pay. That was something when the IRA first came out that was going to be a huge enabler for the smaller, earlier stage companies that we spend a lot of time tracking. So that is really going to help preserve the usability of a lot of these credits for them.
That's super helpful. Great start. Let me just ask a quick follow-up then. I mean, net in terms of environmental impact, even though there may be some silver linings for some specific technology areas, how do you guys assess what the impact will be in terms of decarbonization in the United States, given the potential headwinds for utility scale solar and wind?
We definitely think that it's going to be tough because obviously those credits were really helpful. I actually think that wind and solar have kind of been waiting for these tax credits to go away for a long time. Like I was part of a lot of discussions every time they came up for renewal about whether or not this was going to happen. But I actually think that the transmission side of things, and obviously we've just seen that big announcement about the Greenbelt line, that is what's really holding back a lot of wind and solar. So even if you had those credits maintained, there are these massive queues of capacity that just aren't able to get built. And a lot of funding was meant to go into transmission. You're seeing a lot of private VC investment in grid tech to try and unlock that. So I see that as also a big blocker for wind and solar. The decarbonization impact that we've been focusing on a lot when it comes to the OBBB and the IRA was that it was really setting the US up very well to start to decarbonize its hard to abate sectors. So thinking about transport, thinking about industry, and the US was becoming the cheapest place in the world and the best place in the world to build these folks. And a lot of that now is gone with OSIP gone. And that is what the US is losing, is this competitiveness in those next generation technologies that we're relying on wind and solar, like hydrogen. But where you go from here and how you actually continue to build out the US power sector is a big question, because the things that are being favored, like geothermal and nuclear and CCS, they're not really getting built en masse until the 2030s. So there is a question of rising demand from data centers and how that is all going to happen in the absence of a grid that's not being built out, and in the absence of these new forms of capacity that are going to take 5 to 10 years to even get through first of a kind projects or meaningful deployment.
Super interesting. I want to come back to the kind of US, European, and rest of the world perspective in a bit, but that's a great framing for us. JC, I'm going to go to you next, and I'd love your big picture take on where we are, not just the bill, but the current status of things, kind of 6 months into the administration, what it means for your members and your work.
I think, Andrew, first, thanks for the opportunity. I think we're it's not a wait and see, obviously, but I think there's still some steps that we've seen the result of what happened, as Julia outlined, with the One Big Beautiful Bill. I think there's still an implementation phase that comes, and so everybody's kind of watching now. Will Treasury hit the mark with some guidance on this next year where people would make investments? Will they make that? What will that look like? Will it be kind of what's in current law? Will it be current law with some changes? Will it be completely starting from scratch? I think people are looking at that. I think people are also looking at what impact do some of these regulations around foreign entity of concern and direct engagement with Chinese entities in some sectors of the economy, not just clean energy economy, but other parts of the economy. So I think there's a lot of that. I think longer term, I think, as Julia said, transmission still continues to be an issue, and it has been for the last many years. I think getting electrons to load in some of these places where, especially on the wind side, it's been super consolidated, and it's not kind of the transmission build that hasn't kept up with the build of wind. Solar is famous for cannibalizing itself in a given area fairly quickly. How do you solve those problems? And I think at the end of last year, the Congress was really close to solving that. And a big part of that and piece of that is how we allocate costs among the various organized markets in this country. There were some steps that were taken that got us close. And I think that, restarting that debate and the permitting reform debate is something that brings all the energy sectors together. I don't have high hopes for it this year. I think this year it's still kind of the churn, and we had One Big Beautiful Bill. I think we'll see what the fall brings, but I think that is a place where you're already starting to see, in the Congress, people are coming around to this idea of could we do something else? And I think there's a lot of political headwinds and tailwinds that are wrapped up in that. But if you're asking me, where does the industry sit? I think, as Julia said, the industry had incentives for a long time. I think just having the business certainty to let the existing investments that were made in anticipation of having those credits, I think, is important. And then also continuing this discussion around how do we continue with market stability. I know we were going to talk about that a little more. When I speak in public, I've said this for years, capital chases certainty. And so I think that people will continue to stay in this market. There are some very large balance sheet players, especially in the onshore and solar side and the storage side. I think that those people will continue to be patient, and those projects will continue. I think it's what are we looking at in that 27, 28 timeframe? Do states have the ability to chart their own energy path, right? I think that's something that governors are starting to think about as some of this gets messaged and starts to really kind of where the rubber meets the road. But again, coming full circle. I think figuring out this next 2 weeks, does Treasury meet their mark? What does that look like? Is there another year of investment for real around some of the particulars that the industry really looks at and the financial industry looks at as they, as you know, as they make investments? And then kind of beyond that, how do we continue to permit projects, right? So that those projects that are already in the pipeline, that have financing, that have offtake, that have all the things that you need to move projects along, how do those get over the finish line? And I think those are two things where the industry will be very focused over the next couple of years.
I was on mute myself. I've seen some commentary, JC, that there could be a surge in development and utility scale renewables in the next year for people just to get those credits. Are you hearing that as well?
I think there's been the term stockpiling, right? And so I think the industry, these are long timeline assets, right? So if I didn't already have a project that was ready to go, I'm not going to be able to get it permitted, get it whatever in 2 or 3 years. So I think that's probably a fear that's not that's unfounded, especially given, even if we consider what it would take to do that, the costs associated with warehousing equipment and doing those kinds of things. I do think, though, that there are some generation sources do buy equipment in bulk, right? I mean, it just makes sense to buy at scale. But I don't think that there's a rush to get anything done, because you have to have, for all the reasons that Julia outlined earlier, there has to be these steps in the process to be able to have these projects and get them to a place where they can actually qualify for this tax credit in the time that's left. And so I don't think that, there's not a rush to the altar. Let's put it that way.
Interesting. We'll come back to a few themes you raised as well, including what this will mean for member businesses of yours. Heather, you have been in the crucible of this and really eager to get your point of view. You were kind enough to join us last December after the election with Stacey's colleague, Jason Gourmet. We had a great session talking about what to expect. We're now 6 months, 7, 8 months past that. You've been so much a part of this conversation. Tell us what you think, macro level, again, starting at the highest level. Does this bill, does it help at all? Are there silver linings? What were the areas where you and other colleagues of yours were able to get better outcomes out of the Senate?
Yeah. Again, thanks for having me. Again, I'm a repeat customer, I guess. I'm visiting with you. So, a few things. I'm going to give a couple of takeaways. One is that probably when I was with you back those 8 months ago, I was more optimistic about a balance of Republicans coming at an all the above approach. I'm not seeing that, at least from the administration side. And it's making it harder for members of Congress who have been Republicans, who have been so-called champions of certain kinds of technologies or just engaged on the climate discussion and decarbonization, to actually, speak up. No one that I'm aware of has successfully engaged with President Trump, either domestically or internationally, and won in some cases. So we're dealing with kind of a new entity. We're dealing with the Trump 2 White House. The second thing is I was hopeful that those Republicans who were engaging, who had created the Conservative Climate Caucus, part of the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is both is bicameral and bipartisan, would really start to work together and coalesce. That didn't happen as much through the reconciliation process, and some of that is just a surprise from what came from the White House, that there is clearly a some of the above approach, not an all the above approach. Every Republican that I've been working with has been all the above. I'd say governors right now are still at an all the above approach, but in Washington, it's making it harder. And it really is the administration. Certainly, we've expected the Freedom Caucus, a few members in the Senate that never were there. on decarbonization. We're never really there on renewable energy or even on tax credits. And it's appearing that there's like this cabal in Washington that's really becoming anti-renewable. I think it's a mistake to call it a cabal that's anti-renewable, but certainly we're seeing more than we have from the previous administration. And we were looking at some of that kind of all the above. There's also a backlash from the previous administration. There was particularly House Republicans saw that there was a hand on the scale towards renewable energy against fossil fuels. You're seeing that pendulum swing one side to the other. They finally, reconciliation, the IRA was created during reconciliation. That is a partisan process. Both sides of the aisle use it. Now Republicans have just used it, and the one big beautiful bill. And it has driven a lot of partisanship now with Republicans. So the idea is, how do we get back to actually legislating and creating bipartisan policy that can actually stand the test of time and create that business certainty that JC was talking about? And I think that is my biggest takeaway is, where do we go for business certainty? What do investors and entrepreneurs and innovators need to continue to help make our country great, to help to all the goals that we have? And it doesn't feel like we're there right now. We're not sticking it.
Very well said. And we want to jump into those competitiveness issues and frankly, the business certainty issues. But before I do, Heather, what accounts for some of the seeming outright opposition to specific technologies like solar and wind? I mean, we've heard the president talk about he doesn't like wind farms and their impacts on birds. I don't know if that's really it, or just sight lines for his golf courses or whatever. But it does feel like we're far away from a technology neutral, kind of all the above strategy, like you said, where, hey, let the best technology win. And we even have a tax credit, right, that's technology neutral. And yet it doesn't seem like it's almost like there's a bias against the biggest clean energy technologies.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, quite honestly, surprising, because we didn't see this again in Trump 1. We saw the surge of batteries in the first administration as well, which was an important piece of creating more baseload power rather than intermittency that renewables get criticized for. So this clearly is something thought out and different than what we saw in the first administration, which tells me there's a lot, it means it's more on House and Senate Republicans to actually create that balance, that checks and balance. I think that we need more than ever right now. The why, you get in President Trump's head. I mean, from what I understand on a lot of the wind, it's really from that Scotland sightlines, actually litigation, Trump losing and having to pay. And he's been fairly consistent in finding solar getting dragged into that. I think the other piece is there are a lot of Republicans who were not in favor of, have not been in favor of tax credits or long-term tax credit, and they see tax credits for newer nascent technologies versus longer-term technologies. And then, but even if that's the case, you still had most members of Congress saying, at the end of the day, business certainty. And then Senate, they came back from the House bill and said, well, we believe in business certainty. We have to give these businesses and these technologies off ramps, even if it's a year or so. It's better than just cutting them off the end of this fiscal year or beyond. So I think that business certainty argument is really what's, I think, driving a lot of Republicans to kind of stay the course. And then it's more uncharted territory dealing with what's going on with wind and solar and what happened. Look, I'm a Republican in Washington doing this work every day. I'm scratching my head.
Yeah. And there was also this idea, and I'll open this up to everybody. Early this year, Heather, we talked about it, and I've talked with others, that a lot of this also could be localized, where, if you said, hey, so many of these credits are going to red counties, red states. We just need to get those local lawmakers advocating for the job creation in their district. That didn't seem to happen, really, unless there were certain, maybe a few carve outs. But, on a macro level, people didn't show up to support those kind of industrial investments in counties where, battery factories, solar, et cetera. Why do we think that was? I don't know, JC, maybe you have some insights into this, because I assume you guys were also trying to get support from those Republicans who have major projects being built in their districts.
Yeah, JC, if you want to go ahead, then I can add on if you'd like.
Andrew, honestly, I think it's a mixed bag. I think that in some places there was that kind of bottom up, and it reached an intended audience. Now, as Heather said, at the end of the day, did those members like go to the absolute ends of the earth? No,
Yes.
they didn't, right? And so we have to just be honest about that. That didn't happen. I do think that some tech is, storage still seems to, have some glide path to success. Got a longer run of tax credits. I do think that building it here still matters, and I think that the industry is still committed to that. I think that what becomes difficult is you can't have, and you know this as well as anybody, you can't have manufacturing without the projects, right? You have to have scale to feed your manufacturing. And right now, the project side of that equation is a little bumpy, right? It's super lumpy. And so how do I scale manufacturing when I don't have real line of sight across tech to what the deployment looks like domestically? And not even, it's as I know we're going to get to this, like as Heather said, whether you love or hate the tax credits, business certainty matters, right? And so having that, and even the investment decisions made around manufacturing, early stage manufacturing, it has to start further downstream before it can go up. But those decisions were made around market projections that had incentives attached to them. And it's not to say that that industry won't recover. I do think that there's certainly a path to there being a need for those green electrons. And I still think they're cost competitive, unsubsidized. They're all the things, right? I think the market does PPA structures and the kind of complicated market mechanisms do have to see some glide path to a rebound. But I do think that the tech is here, and against a backdrop where no one is saying we don't need every electron we can get, right? I think we're even talking about sources of power. I think Julie was kind of alluding to that there are some nascent, very expensive sources of power that want to come into the market, and they're being entertained because we need every electron we can get at this point. And I think that some of those generation technologies are constrained, whether it's order supply chain, whether it's getting the molecules where they need to go. And what seems to be ready, at least in the near term, is a lot of wind and solar, and that's what's in the queues. And so I do think, and I hope that that market reality bears itself out. But I think this idea that, back to your questions, that like there was this local groundswell, and I think in some places that's worked, in other places it hasn't. I think that there's also a grass top exercise. I think governors are starting to realize that they don't maybe have the freedom of choice in energy that they might have had in some of these states previously. And as Heather said, I was at a manufacturer during the first administration, and we deployed a lot of wind, right? That just was the fact of the matter. And so I think, how do we find our way back there is, I think, what everybody is focused on now. And I think that there's a great story of domestic manufacturing to tell. But again, when you're lumpy on the project side, it's really hard to scale on the manufacturing side.
We'll
Andrew,
get to that. Go ahead.
If I can, I was just going to add to some of the politics of I've heard from a lot of people talking about 80% of the projects, or 70 to 80%, are in red districts. Republicans should love this. Well, don't forget, yes, I mean, sure, jobs are important, and it seemed like it was a talking point created by Democrats for Republicans. And so then you've got the IRA, which not a single Republican voted for because it's a partisan process. A lot of in the bill in the IRA had genealogy that was Republican. And I think we talked about that 8 months ago. And so, tax credits, or even, energy efficiency tax credits for wind and solar. These are all tax credits that have moved through and got, touched in some way, enhanced, moving through the process, and now are deemed Democrat I mean, so that partisan process has been disastrous. And for those of us who have been working on the Republican side, going towards bipartisanship, we felt like this was a Mack truck coming straight for us. And boy, is it. Now, I think, the lesson that, I'm learning is, and I want to convey to anyone who will listen, so I'll take this opportunity to say that we can't just, rather everyone, I know a lot of people are really frustrated by what's happened. And it's kind of like, there goes the Republicans again, doing what they've always done. We should never have trusted them in the first place. I think that's a mistake. I think really what we really need at the end of the day is bipartisanship. And these partisan bills erode the trust that we need in our legislature to be able to create durable policy that we all care about. And that's not happening. We're working on a partisan basis. I mean, a reconciliation is a spike of the football. We won. And of course, there's talk about another reconciliation bill, at least out of the House. And I'm seeing some of the Republican senators going, we have to work on a bipartisan basis every day. And this erodes our trust and confidence among peers. We can't keep legislating this way. So I hope more senators say that and we stop legislating by reconciliation and really encourage Republicans and Democrats to work together.
I think that's actually a really important point that Heather is making around this idea of manufacturing capacities and certainty. Because in the same way as JC made the point, like, you can't just build a project overnight, it takes some time. You also can't, at least in the US, build a manufacturing plant overnight. It takes several years. And I think the policy whiplash that we've seen that Heather's referencing, it just makes it so difficult as a company to feel comfortable making billions of dollars in investment because, the IRA brought in a lot of domestic content laws that would have incentivized a lot of new capacity in the US for the components of wind and solar and batteries. But a lot of them were being made by investments from companies from other countries. And the tariffs and the more stringent foreign entity of concern rules that are more targeted to companies rather than just where the parts are coming from makes it very difficult to see how that manufacturing supply chain is developed in the US, because you're looking at the US and you say, well, they change their minds every 4 years. And what if I build this in the US and then a new administration comes in and then suddenly there are like lower tariffs on China and I get outcompeted? So another vote for bipartisan consistency in a lot of this legislation.
Well, good time I'm going to ask Gareth Burns' question. Gareth's from BP Ventures. How do you anticipate this political behavior from across the spectrum could change as the realities of midterms get closer? JC, thoughts?
I'm gonna let Heather start that one. I'll come in line.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans are pretty Republicans feel like overall, take a step back from energy and renewable energy and take a look at the One Big Beautiful Bill. President Trump was able to get a piece of signature law passed in a partisan way with, really, getting, let me see, hurting Republicans, maybe hog-tying some Republicans to be able to pass the bill. No tax on tips, border security, things that he promised on the campaign trail are now a reality and funded. So for a lot of Americans and a lot of Trump supporters, Trump is doing exactly what he said he was going to do, and that is motivating them. On the other side, you have a very motivated Democratic Party who's like, we get anything but what we have right now. So I think the midterms are not like a slam dunk where we see historically that the party that is not the presidency gains. President Trump's already seen this movie once before and losing 40 to 60 seats in both chambers. So he's learned his lesson, and they're working very hard to try not to lose. So do not put your eggs in the midterm basket is what I'm saying. We're going to have to, I mean, certainly things can happen there, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with the Washington that's becoming increasingly partisan. We need to find bipartisan opportunities. You mentioned permitting as being perhaps one of those, but we need to start creating a culture of winning. So in midterms, I think we're going to start to see another reconciliation bill, some must pass legislation. And then nothing gets done because we're in midterms. And then we'll be dealing with lame duck after that, and where anything's possible in lame duck.
It's Heather said, there are so many twists and turns, Andrew. I mean, you just in the last week, you've seen what's happening in Texas. Other blue states are starting to respond in kind. Like it's just a mess, right? And I think that it is symptomatic and emblematic of what's happened, which is for whatever reason, everybody's just run to the polls, right? So there's not a hell of a lot in the middle anymore. I think that also there's a lot of calendar between now and wherever. I think people will continue to watch the president's numbers. They will continue to watch their own, like how they're being treated in their districts. I think there's any number of things that will happen between now and then. But to Heather's point, like if that's where everyone's hanging their hats, like, oh, that feels hard, right? So it's like, how do we develop what previously was not a hyper-partisan issue, right? Energy is not energy, and energy security and national security and all the things that get wrapped up in that have been a part of both parties' talking points for a long, long time, right? And it also is something that we've done well. I mean, we've developed gas in the U.S. We've got the cheapest gas there is to have. We have a significant part of our generation mix is clean. Like it's cheap. Like the cost of energy is not an impediment to doing business in the U.S., right? As Julia and Heather alluded to, it takes a long time to build something here, right? That's an impediment to doing business in the U.S. But energy, the cost of energy is not. And so I think that has long been a story. I keep having to believe it comes back, not naively. I think we're working to have that story be told. But I do think like banking on the midterms is not a strategy for success, and I don't think it's something the industry's doing.
Really interesting. All right, we have a couple of chat questions. I'm wondering if we can quickly, Heather, have you maybe respond to a couple of these. Like one is, if the GOP was really opposed to credits, why didn't they take a scalpel to any credits for oil and gas? The other is, what did the IRA need to have or exclude to be more bipartisan in the first place? So you were sort of saying like it was identified as a totally Dem bill. What could have been done differently? Can you respond to those two?
Yeah. So on the tax credits, this is always one of those. I as an advocate in Washington, I never bring up to Republicans the tax credits for oil and gas versus renewable energy because it'll get me kicked out of the room, and I won't be invited back. And I'd like to be invited back. So that's always been a long term, like what a head scratcher there too, as to why. Is there a political reason there? It's built in for whatever reason. And I tend to operate in the what's politically possible. And so for tax credits being a long term on the renewable energy side, this is where Republicans have been for the most part. Not all Republicans. There are a lot of Republicans who really feel like, tax credits, particularly for energy, help America be energy dominant. And that has, a cascading positive effect. So you say the GOP, it's not all the GOP, it's certain members. And it's a growing number. I think what we need to prevent though is those Republicans making this kind of feeling anti-renewables part of a new Republican plank again. We can't go backwards. The second part was on IRA and what could have done to make it more bipartisan. Yeah, I mean, look, the reconciliation process is innately partisan at the end of the day. Just assuming that everything would have passed the way it would have, what would have really have made the difference, even in a short term, would have been the passage of comprehensive permitting. We would have seen maybe the fruits of the IRA sooner. I'll set aside some of the guidance that took forever to get in some areas, but at least we would have seen the benefits more quickly, and maybe the political calculus would have been more challenging for individual members having to vote against the bill because so much was happening, so much positive was happening. But this is one of the pieces. When the IRA was passed, it didn't translate into in Biden's election. So this isn't just kind of an IRA problem. This was a party problem, the Democratic Party. And then, of course, when you name something, the Inflation Reduction Act, but really has a massive part in dealing with energy. It really didn't. The name didn't really go along with it. So a lot of people were confused. They're having a lot of problems talking about the benefits of the bill itself. And then you say, hey, Republicans, you should talk about the bill yourself because it's in your districts. And they're like, no, we want to win this election. So, you can win, you can win the battle, but lose the war. And I think this is an example of that.
Really interesting. Maybe they should have called it the Big Beautiful Bill.
I'm not opposed to anything that works.
Yeah. Let's zoom out. Let's zoom out a bit. Julia, we have a couple questions. Our friend Colin Leduc from Generation, for example, is asking how will this impact the US's stance at COP30 and frankly in global negotiations generally. So curious if you have a take on that. And also, you guys are looking at the investment landscape globally. So you're looking at China and Europe and other geographies. How do you see this in terms of putting the US at a disadvantage when it comes to attracting capital for investment in these new technologies? We've already seen a few companies sort of saying they're going to pick up and move to Europe to do their first of a kind plants or whatever, if they're, more hard tech. But curious to get your take on the global perspective, and then we can hear from others too.
Yeah, I will answer the COP question first. It's really difficult not to have the US there as a ready and willing partner because they so often were kind of underwriting everything. So obviously all the funding for developing economies that was meant to be going to making their power systems cleaner, a lot of that money was coming from the US. And it was almost like other countries needed to see movement from the US in order for them to feel good about moving forward. So I think at COP, I will really be watching to see what China does if they start to move forward as a group that is wanting to lead much more in the climate discussions. Certainly, they've been thinking a lot about how can they develop supply chains in other regions that complement the resources that they don't have. That's often done with a renewable technology in mind. So what materials do they need for that? Can they move their manufacturing capacity to Southeast Asia to have more access to the market, these kinds of things. So I definitely think the US will not really be a big factor in the negotiations. China may fill that gap. And I'm also really interested to see what happens with India, because India has been a big question for a long time. They are kind of all in on solar. When you go to India and you talk to people, it's taken for granted that they can produce very cheap solar. We've seen IPOs and some successes there in terms of micromobility. So it's a very dynamic market in terms of climate tech right now. But yeah, it's definitely going to deflate the funding ambition at COP. And then in terms of investment outside the US, I want to make a distinction between investment in early stage companies and then investment in projects, because you divided those two up yourself, Andrew, and I think it's two very different stories. When we looked at the latest H1 investment numbers, we actually saw VC investment in the US jump 21% compared to H1 2024. So there are definitely tons of companies out there who are waving away multiple balance sheets, who are saying, like, we are leading a brand new area of tech, and a lot of people want to be a part of that. I think the capital stack in the US is second to none. And I don't expect to see a huge wave of startups suddenly moving to Europe. What I do expect to see is a lot of project finance moving to Europe, because Europe has been incredibly consistent. They have said, we do not want to deindustrialize. We want to keep manufacturing here. And you can see that in how they set up CBAM. You can see that in how they prioritized industrial decarbonization as shoring up clean energy manufacturing supply chains. So Rondo Energy is a good example. US company based in the US, first focus is going to be in Denmark for their thermal energy storage system. So I think you'll see a lot more projects in Europe, and you'll see a lot more hesitance to invest in the US in those big ticket items.
Really interesting. JC, what's your take on that? I mean, you have members who are global, right? And they're international or European companies investing here as well in clean energy. I mean, what are you hearing from them? Are they going to put more resources into Europe and other geographies now?
I just think it depends on the tech. Most of our development community, on the land-based side, let's separate offshore for now. I think offshore is its own story. You saw Ørsted, the news of the morning, with what they're having to do in Europe, given their U.S. investment and an inability to sell a position in one of their projects. But I do think, for the most part, from our developer crowd, they are not developing a lot outside the US, maybe a little in Canada, maybe some south, but most of it is here in the US. And that's for a reason, right? The US has been a large, stable market for a long time. And so I think they have balance sheets, they'll stay here. I don't think they'll go other places. I do think that, some of our companies that have large positions from European entities, like let's say European oil majors or whatever, I think they'll stay the course for now. I think we have to see longer term. I think the market's still adjusting. And if I come full circle to what I said in the beginning, like, what does this guidance look like? Can the projects be permitted? There's just a lot of questions that are still open and out there. And I think that for now, most of that pipeline, at least for the next couple years, is fairly locked in. Permits in place, with some exception. I think, assuming that none of that changes, and we don't take anything for granted, but assuming that that still remains the same, I think you'll see that for the next couple of years, there'll still be deployment. I think it's what happens in the 27, 28 timeframe. What does that look like if there's no kind of meaningful movement or capital allocation to what happens beyond that? Then I think that starts to be a little bit more of an issue, and something that we'll be watching.
Really interesting. So I have a question then, following up with you, and maybe Heather, your take on this too. The FEOC restrictions. How are you seeing those impact things? How do they complicate the outlook for certain technologies, batteries especially? And how are people planning to deal with that?
You saw me take a deep breath.
And when I say FEOC, foreign entities of concern, and this is again, to bring more of this activity, manufacturing development here to the US, just so people are aware.
And let's just stick with China for now. I mean, if we get into the critical mineral space, maybe that implicates other places. Yeah. But I do think, my understanding is the current idea is that it would go to notice and comment rulemaking. So if it goes that route, then it goes. And I do think how it gets implemented, and the box that the statute drew or didn't draw, I mean, it's going to be complicated. And I think things like material assistance, everybody watches. There are some of these buzzwords that you're hearing a lot about that will matter. How do the rules impact intellectual property? What does effective control look like? Those are the kind of things that at least I will be spending a lot of time engaging on, just to make sure that whatever comes out of Treasury is workable and financeable. Because if it's not, then that's an issue. I think the industry still tries to, even through that process, how do you continue to look more domestic and be more domestic? I think in certain technologies, as you said, storage, what does that look like? How does that play out in solar? It's been playing out in solar for a long time. To Julia's earlier point, how does trade actions and tariffs and all the other stuff that complicates the math on the other side of the ledger impact those investments? We're playing in all those spaces, right? With 232 and 201 and 301 and all the tariff soup on the one side and those actions, and then how does that get overlaid with this foreign entity of concern? But what I would say is, if it goes this notice and comment, Andrew, it's not an avoidance. It's just we're at the beginning of that process, right? Right now, they're really focused at Treasury on what does the safe harbor guidance look like that they say they're going to put out here in the next couple of weeks. And then I think they will turn in earnest to what does the foreign entity of concern piece look like. But I think that will be a much longer process going forward.
Yeah, I was going to just just add on to JC's more technical comments. There's the politics, and then there's like the policy, the practicality of what these, what the guidance will do. And on the political side, if you ask, and I've done a lot of polling, talking to voters, what do you think about putting greater restrictions on China and importing any kind of good from China? And it's like, oh yeah, kick the shit out of them. It's great, wonderful. So you translate that into the Republicans going like, we have to stop China. We can't, anything green enriches China. And that's the politics and kind of that mouth foaming and what's going. And we've got to there needs to be a lot of education here about what is actually possible with restrictions. I don't think anyone on this call or that I work with is saying like enrich China, sure, go ahead. The U.S. can take a back seat, but it's like, what's the practice of doing this, and what comes out of Treasury is going to be really important. And of course, I think all of us have a concern. What kind of hand tipping on scale are we dealing with when you already see a pretty biased administration? And is Treasury going to give a fair shake, or is it something that's more mission impossible? That's something that we'll be working on, and of course, partnering with ACP and others.
Very helpful. I'd love to get your quick takes on some of the silver lining areas. So we're not all gloom and doom here. One of the ones that you were most surprised or that you're most excited about, obviously nuclear people have talked about, advanced geothermal, carbon capture. And then I want to get into talking about the grid and power reliability given the AI demand surge. But let's start with some of those. Are there areas here that you're excited about or thought, hey, this is a nice big surprise and could be a boost? Anybody?
I was surprised, actually, considering the process of having a bill in the House could it get worse, then go to the Senate, and we actually saw the protection of the hydrogen tax credits, 45V tax credits, that they were lobbied kind of back in by members of Congress. Kind of told me that the process system can work. You can get something back in. There is enough support. I know that several, like Shelley Moore Capito, who is chair of Environment and Public Works, was supportive, but so were a number of others. I thought that was a good indication that nascent technology, it is very important that we need to continue to invest. We don't fall behind with China and others. I hope this tax credit really helps the industry. So for me, that was one, good for the industry, two, good for the political process. Check.
Cool. JC or Julia, any others?
We were certainly heartened by storage. I think storage, there's a recognition that it pays, it's valuable across technologies. So it's not just renewable. It can be used with gas. But there is a recognition that it's an important part of the grid and grid reliability and ancillary services and all the other kinds of things that you would want. And I think that for us, the recognition of that and giving it a little bit longer run also was a positive. And to Heather's point, right, has been bipartisan support for that. And for whatever reason, that managed to find its way through the toxicity of the process. And that was heartening for us.
Great.
Yeah, I mentioned transferability and direct pay right at the top, and I think that is really important for a lot of these early projects. But there's also been a lot of talk about innovation. And kind of when I saw that, I thought, okay, maybe this is a backdoor for a lot of earlier stage tech to still have some support and consideration. So the point about R&D expenses being able to be more easily deducted, I think that could potentially be very interesting for some of these companies. A lot of work to get there and figure out how to leverage that, but I think there are some cracks in the window for a few things to get through.
Very interesting. Let's turn to the other kind of big issue that this administration and frankly everybody is paying attention to, which is the surging power needs for data centers and AI. And, Heather, some people would say that really pointed to the need for an all of the above strategy, and that we should be incentivizing more energy generation, clean gas, everything we need right now to support this surge in demand. Did that argument work when you were on the Hill or talking to the White House? You can frame it as energy dominance. You can talk about it as global competitiveness. But if AI is the thing driving the tech sector and our markets right now, don't we want to do everything from an energy perspective to support it and make it sustainable?
I don't think it worked. I mean, if you really think where we landed on bills, I don't think it worked. I think like we thought it would, maybe closer to that. These technologies are in red states and they should care about it. So, which means we need to be thinking about our talking points and meeting members where they are, where it really can be effective. Look, we do see that there's going to be acceleration of other kinds of energy production. The president, the White House put out a couple weeks ago, kind of AI roadmap for what they want to do. I read it and went like, this doesn't make sense with some of the things that we need to do.
It's inconsistent internally.
It feels really inconsistent. So, how do we get there? I mean, there was already a lot of like co-location for data centers and others using wind and solar. Will that continue to change? Is there a different way of investment so that they can continue to meet the needs? Or do we just need to have it flop on its face in some way? Is there a brownout? Is there some kind of something, not necessarily catastrophic, but enough indications that policymakers, both in the local level, state and federal, go, wait a minute. We signed up for this and we can't possibly deliver what we're trying to do. I mean, we say we need every single electron we can get. And if they're green, great. Because we're producing more of them. But we also need them to be efficient too. We pulled out efficiency and tax credit. So I think, in Washington right now, and we're sitting at August recess, I feel like we're kind of sitting in this, where are we as a party and as a country? Where's our North Star on this? And if you feel like I'm not really sure, then you're in good company. I think a lot of people are feeling that way, wanting to re-engage, in September and really in talking to staff. We're talking to staff right now, like, where's your boss's head right now? And right now, all they say is, do not say reconciliation to us, at least in the Senate. Everyone's exhausted and they're kind of turning their head to something they can win on, which is like permitting. Maybe there's something to do there. So I think there's a lot of inconsistencies. And so that means there's an opportunity for us to get in and educate and to talk about the gaps that we have. And certainly when that activity or something negative happens, you kind of go, aha, see, this is what we're talking about, and make a lot of hay about it.
We actually have a question from Travis Fisher on permitting. Maybe, Heather, you can just quickly pick that up and we'll go to the others.
Sure.
Did you see that? What provisions are likely to be
sorry.
included? What provisions are likely to be included in a 60-vote permitting reform package in the Senate? I'm sure you know Travis. So.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think nothing got over last time because of the needing to have some kind of judicial reform and Democrats not wanting that. I'm hearing there's discussion about having something that's more in the middle. And that Democrats, particularly led by Sheldon Whitehouse, want to do something that's a little bit more transformative. However, if you're talking about putting in another reconciliation bill, you're eroding that, getting to 60 votes to actually pass something. So, and then a lot of Democrats are saying, well, you just got rid of so much for renewable energy. What am I voting for again? So there's some education there about, well, let's go ahead and get to something that we feel like can be beneficial to why we still have tax credits, why we still have momentum to help the industry. So, I mean, it really is in the eye of the beholder. I think Senator Lee had indicated he was interested in picking up where the bill was left between Manchin and Barrasso. I think that's a good sign. It's also a good sign that we see Chairman Westerman and Congressman Golden, a bipartisan bill in the House, start to move. Sure, those are great, but I got to tell you, the political waters in Washington are pretty bad right now. So I've asked some of my colleagues and friends, like, do you think anything could happen before the end of the year? No one's betting on that. So we're getting into next year. in all likelihood, but look, we've been wrong before. Judicial review.
JC, yeah. What do you
Yeah.
think about any chance
I
for?
think there's a lot of positive noises. I think, but at this point, it's just that. I mean, we're certainly committed to it. I think there's some sense, and I think Heather's touched on this a little bit, that if you want to take out kind of these political, and Julia was talking earlier, the violent swings of the pendulum politically, right? Regardless of the energy source. So whether you're clean, whether it's renewable, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's whatever, if you're going to take out the kind of violent swings of the regulatory universe, really the only way to do that is in legislation, right? And so I think that right now, as Heather rightly pointed out, there seems to be a lot of kind of people, in defensive crouches trying to figure out what it looks like on a lot of different issues. But I think there is some recognition that if you want to get rid of the regulatory kind of buzzsaw swinging back and forth all the time, then you really have to legislate that. Judicial review is something that is always popping up. If you're going to limit access to courts in the front, how can you put a shot clock in the back? I think those are things that have to be worked through. But I think, if you're really are committed to project development and deployment, there is a way to do this without undermining environmental statutes. But it's tough, right? And as Heather said, we got so close at the end of last year, and then, the wheels came off the proverbial bus right at the end. And that was hard for us for a lot of reasons. We'd been heavily invested in that. The transmission provisions in that were, I think, transcendent, to be honest, and to get, utilities to come to the table and everybody to be kind of in the same place was important. And I think as we get back into that, we'll have to see how that goes. But I think all of that is to say, the way that I think you get rid of some of this whiplash back and forth is to legislate some of this. And I think hopefully that will bring people to the table.
And it would be great if we could do that under a bipartisan banner of, hey, energy abundance and powering the future. All right, my final question for each of you, and if you could maybe finish this up in 30 to 60 seconds, is, we've been talking about federal policy, but we've left out two other constituents, which are states and localities, and there is some interplay between those, obviously, if Fed's trying to tamp down what California can do, for example. But are we gonna see some kind of effort by states and localities to make up the difference in some way? And then the other is corporate commitments, right? So, particularly when it comes to power for AI, I mean, the hyperscalers have all made these major commitments on decarbonization and net zero. Do you see any of that slipping as a result of these changes? Julie, do you want to go first?
Sure. We actually just published a report on data center powering models. And the thing for me that really just came out of that is this idea of corporates and states working together. Because when you see this massive boom in power for AI and data centers, you're really putting a lot of generation and powering decisions back in the hands of corporates. And of course, they've been a big force in wind and solar deployment. So I think you will see more and more corporates who want to use data center capacity as a way to leverage clean capacity, working individually with states. And I think they can do a lot there with tariffs, with permitting, with case studies.
Great. Heather?
Yeah, I'm going to go to thinking about COP in 2019. And when the Trump administration was pulling out, had a skeleton crew, and who came to the rescue? Corporations, state, localities were all represented in Madrid. And I saw a silver lining in that, because to decarbonize is going to take all of us. And so it's not just the federal government or a US just writing the check and saying, here you go. It needs engagement across the board. So I'm looking at COP30 as an opportunity to see those corporations, localities, states that we are still in group to really continue to grow. And I think it just needs to continue. It needs to own a certain part of the constituency, whether or not the US is in or out, because we're seeing this flip-flop, and make sure that we continue to have the commitments And I do think you're going to see more from states and locales because we saw it once before. I expect to see it again this time, hopefully not with any kind of COVID or epidemic getting in the way of that progress.
Great. JC, final words for you.
I just think that as you watch what happens at state and local levels, they want to be they want to dictate their own energy future, right? And so I think that be it red state, be it blue state, they want to be able to use the types of electrons they want to use. They want to use all of them. They want to use part of them. They want to, whatever it is, they want to dictate their own energy future. And I think at the end of the day, with the data center push, there won't be data centers without the electrons to power them, right? They're not gonna, no utility is gonna say come and not have the power to feed that data center. It just won't happen. You have huge reliability issues. So at the end of the day, I think that they will be persuasive. I think we've used the analogy of choppy waters and whatever. I just think that this has got to sort itself out. And I think it will, because energy prices are going to start to rise, and that's going to get people's attention. Because to Heather's point, midterms are coming, right? And if energy prices are up, like, that's not good for anybody. And so I think that at some point this sorts itself out, and we're working to be a constructive part of that solution.
Terrific. Well, thank each of you for your terrific contributions and insights to this dialogue, and for the work that you're doing, Julia, Heather, JC. We appreciate it. All your organizations are doing really critical work, and we will follow this webinar up by sending out links to each of your organizations and some of the commentaries that you guys have already pointed us to on this, so people can follow up if they want to learn more. But thank you all, and thanks everyone for joining us on the webinar. We appreciate your questions and your insights and your efforts to move us together forward on this journey. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andrew. Cheers.
Take care.